talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
I'm pretty good. How about yourself?
Good. How does my audio sound?
It sounds like you've got a new microphone.
Well, I debuted the new microphone last week. This
Yep.
week, I am debuting some software, Crisp.ai. I don't mind plugging it because anytime you find something that's really cool, that really, improves your day to day and it's simple, I think you should plug it and let everybody know about it. So Crisp.ai basically filters out your background noise. Not a commercial. I think it's freeware, or it's free to start with anyway.
It's not free, but you get 2 hours a week, I think, is what they start off with. But yeah, we don't currently have sponsors or commercials or anything like that. But yeah, like you said, it's a pretty cool little program. Just runs a little app on Windows or Mac, and seems to do a pretty good job of reducing background noise and things like that. Because you never want to be that person, right, on the Zoom call or Teams or whatever it may be, where you can kind of hear everything running in the background. So I thought it was pretty cool. So I'm glad you're getting some uses out of it.
I've been that guy on our podcast for a long time where, we set up rules around me, which is keep your AirPod case far away so you can't click it, and don't squeak in your chair. And so now I've got a good microphone. I've got the noise reduction software. I think I'm ready to go.
There's so many layers of noise reduction. Not even sure if we're not even sure sometimes if like our voices will come out.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So for today's topic, we're going to talk about FIDO. And for those who aren't familiar, that's Fast Identity Online. And there's no better person to talk about that than Andrew Shikiar, who is the Executive Director and Chief Marketing Officer of the FIDO Alliance. And we've got him today. We're very fortunate for that. And thank you for joining. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Great. So I know that FIDO has really started to really kind of get a foothold out there. But before we get to that, one of the things that we like to start to talk about is when we have a guest on is their background in identity and access management. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into IAM?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm not a practitioner per se, but I've, always done a variety of kind of marketing and kind of strategic development type roles in emerging technology. And so I got into identity, I think before identity was cool. Back in 2001, I went back to Sun Microsystems where I previously worked to help them launch something called Liberty Alliance. And I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with Liberty. This was the kind of first standards effort to standardize what became to be known as federated identity. So a lot of the Liberty specs turned into SAML 2 specs, and it was a really interesting time to be in identity because, frankly, it wasn't in the mainstream whatsoever. A lot of my job at that point was to help recruit the initial companies in Liberty Alliance, and so I'd fly around the world and talk to CXOs, and my first part of the conversation would be what is identity? What does identity mean to your business? What does identity mean to your employees, to your customers? And it was always kind of thought-provoking discussion with people who hadn't thought about identity beyond maybe brand identity. So it was a really fun time to be get into that space. I subsequently then worked on Sun's identity management product set and did a lot of go-to-market work there as well. So that was how I first got into identity. I was out of the space for a while, then I got back into it when I joined FIDO Alliance around 5 years ago. And one thing that was kind of fun was to see that the same concepts we were talking about then are relevant today. B, some of those standards are actually now being used. And C, a lot of the people who I worked with back then are still in this space. And in fact, a lot of them are inside of FIDO Alliance. So it's been nice to kind of reunite and get deeper in the identity marketplace.
That's great, Andrew. One of the things I think kind of the starting point we ought to start with, which is, what is FIDO and why was it founded?
Yeah, so FIDO Alliance was founded to address the data breach plague. Data breaches continue to grow in scale and in number. attackers are growing in sophistication and tools. And the vast majority of data breaches are caused by passwords, right? So either passwords being compromised, stolen passwords being stuffed, social engineering taking passwords out of someone's hands. Passwords cause, over 80% of data breaches on an annual basis. And so, passwords are very much the tip of the spear to address the data breach problem, which is why FIDO has focused on that, right? So our mission is simply to reduce industry reliance on passwords in favor of FIDO authentication. Fundamentally, what FIDO is doing is trying to shift the market and shift industry away from being dependent on not just passwords, but really all server-side shared secrets and server-side authentication in favor of an approach that leverages public key cryptography and takes advantage of devices that are in users' hands every day, right? So our tagline is simpler, stronger authentication. So it's stronger authentication using public key cryptography, but also simpler because any FIDO authentication activity is done with a single gesture. So whether that's touching my finger to a phone, touching a security key, inserting a security key, using Face ID, or Windows Hello, this is all just one gesture for me to authenticate myself. And I think that's really important because, as we've all seen, if security is too hard, people won't use it. The opt-in rates go down, especially with consumers. Opt-in rates for second factor authentication go down the more complex it is. So we think that decreasing friction while increasing security is the approach we need to take to get people to actually adopt stronger authentication. Now, one other note I want to make is I said all shared secrets on the server, right? So while any form of MFA or 2FA, that's any second factor for authentication, is better than passwords alone and will protect people against scalable attacks. Frankly, anything on a server can and will be stolen. So that includes OTPs. OTPs are still a shared secret. They're still on a server, albeit for a much shorter period of time, but they can be manipulated, through a man-in-the-middle attack, replay attack, and things like that. That's how a lot of spear phishing attacks are successful. People think they're protected, but they're really not. So hackers are good at their jobs, which is why over 40% of phishing attempts are successful. So we need to put tools in the hands of users that help protect them from the bad guys, but also from themselves, because it's very easy to get phished. Frankly, there's no shame in it because you're dealing with professionals. So we need to implement FIDO authentication to help people prevent people from getting their accounts taken over and other nefarious things happening.
What I'd like to add to that, I think you hit on a really good point about phishing attacks is, we run into the phishing attack where you think, gosh, the person must be stupid to fall for this. But I've seen some, especially videos and conference presentations from like Black Hat where these phishing attacks, some of them are extremely sophisticated. They'll pose as a site like Google, have you log in and provide a one-time password. Really, they're taking that then and in the background, authenticating you and then, changing your password while you're in the site. And it's like, well, I could see how people can get duped into those. Now, those are the more sophisticated ones. It's not your everyday phishing attack, but when the risk is high, it's certainly there.
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to come back to the data point. Right? This is a Google statistic. 40% of well-designed phishing attacks are successful. Right. So yeah, like you said, we're not talking about Nigerian prince, sloppy emails, but these are well-designed phishing attacks that have a 40% success rate, not a click rate, success rate, which is a staggering number. Which and it shows that phishing pays, and it really starts to outline the depth of this problem.
Yeah, 40% is an astronomical number, considering that usually that kind of attack is talking about single-digit success, right? So if you can, I mean, that is just crazy, right? How many people fall for it, and sometimes it's obviously user education plays a big part into it, but even the best can get fooled, and we saw what recently happened with Twitter, right, where they got socially engineered and someone got in and did some things. Now, thankfully, they only cared about Bitcoin, but they could have done a world of damage, like literally, just based off of that social engineering attack and then getting access to the insight tool. So I think it's important to understand that even though you have education, you need to back end it with good, strong methods to enforce and reinforce the security message you're putting out there, which is why MFA is so important.
So I'm glad you're. I mean, not to get off track on the on the direction you want to take this, but I'm glad you raised Twitter, because I think what needs to be clear is that attack could not have happened if those administrators were using FIDO security keys. Full stop. Right? The social engineering attack could not have been successful if those network admins were, who are obviously smart, talented users, if they were using FIDO security keys. That would not have been successful.
It's probably one of the bigger things you could do in an organization. And it still shocks me when Jim and I are working with folks out there that MFA is not kind of standardized. I think what's becoming more prevalent is that MFA is put in place for what they consider privileged access, typically, but they're still not protecting normal users, right, from that kind of thing. So I think at this point, even Gartner, I think, mentioned it, I don't know if it was last year, year before, that MFA is baseline at this point. Password is not good enough. And the easier you can make MFA, the better experience it is. The easier experience is going to be for the user, which means that your security increases and makes it a lot better for everybody. So that's why I think that FIDO is great, because I can see the usability benefits of it, and some of the challenges that it typically solves around some of the more legacy approaches to MFA, right? Things like tokens and SMS, which are easy to intercept, relatively speaking, from security standpoint, email one-time passwords, like all the stuff that you said around it being stored somewhere on a server, right? That kind of thing. But also just the usability aspect of it is huge.
Jeff, I'd also add to that, that is the other angle. So when you think about, the statement passwords are dead, or passwords should be dead, passwords are dinosaurs, it's not just the security aspect, it's also the usability aspect. And for me, that's a big reason why FIDO is so important. Andrew, I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about the usability angle and why that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned before, FIDO's tagline is simpler, stronger authentication, and I think they're part and parcel. If it's not easy, people won't use it, and it needs to be easy for mass adoption. So, FIDO's focused on single gesture, strong user authentication. So, let's take a different lean on this and look at traditional means of MFA. Right? So, multi-factor authentication, or 2FA, is not new. But it's had some challenges, right? And they have both security and usability challenges. All right. So the traditional means, going way back, is having like a token, a dedicated token with a TOTP on it, but a dedicated piece of hardware for each service that you have. All right, so let's talk about that usability for a second. One is you have to, if you're doing a lot of sensitive work, you're gonna have multiple tokens. So you have the token keychain problem. Two, you need to literally juggle, devices to enter in the code to verify yourself to the system. Now compare that to FIDO, where everything, the tokens that you have, say you're using an external security key, what we call a roaming authenticator, that can support multiple services. And again, all you need to do is touch it or insert it, because all you're doing is proving possession of the device. So there's a good example right there of how FIDO provides a superior user experience over the traditional token-based means of multi-factor authentication. Additionally, FIDO obviously supports biometrics, which brings the same benefits of security and privacy of FIDO's public key cryptography underlying architecture. But you can use a biometric to prove possession and to verify yourself also, and that's even easier, right? Where you're just literally, again, touching a device or looking at a camera, right? So any of your users, any of your listeners who use Windows Hello are seeing this every day, right? I log into my PC looking at my camera. I mean, it doesn't get much easier than that, or by touching the fingerprint scanner or using a local PIN. Now, the key thing is that all this is local on the device and all very user-friendly, single action to, things that are traditionally associated with unlocking devices are now being used, with FIDO to log me in, right? So that's kind of the small mental leap we need people to take, is that unlock means login. And the same easy mechanism we have for that is actually doing a highly secure authentication process through the same exact action.
I'm a big fan of Windows Hello. I have been for years. And, I think Jim has mentioned this before, but I'm kind of a tech geek, tech nerd, so I'm kind of on the cutting edge of the technology usually. And, I saw Windows Hello several years back when it was first rolling out, and I couldn't wait for that hardware to become more prevalent in the enterprise, because typically enterprise hardware cycles are somewhere in the 2 to 4 year range, if not longer. And, it's going to be a couple years before the fingerprint reader, the IR camera is standard hardware, right, on most enterprise devices. So I'm excited to see that becoming more of an option in the enterprise. And I'm really excited to hear that Apple joined the FIDO Alliance relatively recently. I think it was maybe a couple months ago at this point. And I'm hopeful that things like Touch ID and the rumored Face ID on the MacBooks, for example, that might be coming out in the future, might be taking advantage of that. And I know that you've got a lot of big heavy hitters in the industry. Maybe you can talk a little bit about folks like Microsoft and Apple and other organizations, Google, that might be part of the alliance and what that brings to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Apple did join FIDO's board of directors in January of this year, and it's been really great. And I think one thing that makes FIDO unique, and I've done a number of standards. I mentioned Liberty Alliance. I've done other kind of multi-stakeholder organizations in my career. What makes FIDO unique is that there isn't really an alternative standards effort, right? There's no Betamax or VHS, not to date myself, but if you're interested in standards-based authentication, it's really FIDO. And Apple joining at the beginning of the year really unified the industry around FIDO authentication. So I think that's really important. But amongst our members, we have 250 something members in the alliance, including a board of around 40 companies. And I think what's really cool about our board of directors is that it has the right composition of companies to address this password problem. So first we have I'll loosely describe these companies as device manufacturers. So people who are creating the devices and platforms that we use every day. So companies on the chipset side like ARM and Intel and Infineon, groups like that, but the platforms, right? So Microsoft, Google, Apple, device manufacturers like Samsung, Lenovo, right? All these companies are involved with FIDO, making sure these platforms and devices support FIDO authentication. Secondly, we have experts in security and biometrics. So both, stalwarts, longtime stalwarts like RSA and groups like that, and OneSpan, but also, emerging companies who are really driving a lot of innovation in the authentication space, like Yubico and Hyper and Knock Knock and groups like that, which are really gaining a lot of traction. And then last but not least, we have the service providers, right? These are the companies whose businesses are dependent upon their ability to deliver high assurance services to billions of users worldwide on a daily basis, right? So they are dependent on FIDO being successful, or else they have to go in a non-standards direction. And so these are the big social networking companies like Facebook and groups like that, the commerce companies like Amazon, payments networks, MasterCard, Visa, American Express, big banks. These are the companies that are helping steer FIDO Alliance. So I think when you look at that kind of breadth of membership that we have at the top, which is also reflected throughout the rest of our membership, I think it gives us a really good starting point to help us be successful in doing the three things that FIDO Alliance does, which is A, build technical specifications based on market requirements. B, we run a certification program and build a really diverse ecosystem of products that are FIDO certified, which companies can use to deploy FIDO authentication. And then last but not least, develop best practices and help people be successful in understanding and driving adoption of FIDO authentication. So yeah, the question started with Apple, but I think it's really important to look at the full range of members that we have, driving FIDO forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a great overview. One thing that I didn't really understand until I started doing more research is, what is the difference between FIDO and FIDO2?
Yeah, well, so let's back up and talk about FIDO's specifications and FIDO architecture at a high level, but specifications. So as I mentioned previously, FIDO authentication leverages public key cryptography. User-friendly public key cryptography. I've heard it be called PKI evolved. But the key thing that we're doing is introducing the concept of an authenticator. An authenticator is both a thing and a concept. It's basically where the private key is stored. And so instead of having being dependent on passwords on a server, instead using public key cryptography, you have a unique key pair for each FIDO account. The private key stays with the authenticator, secure on the user's device, and a public key sits on the server instead of a password. As we all know, public keys have no material value; they can't be reused. So, if and when a breach happens, one thing that's not stolen is password, right? Which starts to break the credential theft cycle, which is plaguing so many companies. But FIDO specifications. So the first set of FIDO specifications that came out, there were two. One was focused on a biometric use case, which was called FIDO UAF, FIDO Universal Authentication Framework. And the second one was based on a second factor use case, U2F, which is popularized by YubiKey and all the other companies now making FIDO security keys. Both of those have the same approach to underlying with, again, the FIDO public key cryptography underlying architecture is supported in both two. The difference is with UAF is basically password replacement with a biometric. In U2F, it was using activating the private key by verifying possession of the device, again, by inserting or touching and interacting with the security key. Whereas backing up a second with UAF, you use a biometric to verify yourself so that the private key could be activated. Those were the first sets of FIDO specifications. We saw a strong take up with both UAF and U2F. U2F had strong pickup, say, inside of Google and is attached to Google services. It still supports Google services. UAF was underpinning a lot of native apps, right? So to the average user, UAF looks no different than if you have a UAF app on your iPhone. It looked no different than your usual Touch ID experience, but is using all the benefits of FIDO authentication rather than just doing a kind of a password cut and paste, which is what the native biometric would do typically with Touch ID. So even though we had good uptake with both two of those, what FIDO realized was that to gain scale and to truly be in position to address the password problem, we needed to target the platforms, starting with the web. Right. So FIDO was working on something called the FIDO 2.0 web APIs. Inside the Alliance, we made a strategic decision to contribute these to the W3C, and that became the web authentication working group, the web authn working group inside of W3C. Started in the beginning of 2016, and that's how FIDO decided to target the web, right? So in cooperation with W3C and the web authn working group, we had a lot of stakeholders in both FIDO and W3C working on that. That's part of the FIDO 2 specification. The other part of the FIDO 2 specification was an extension of U2F called CTAP, Client to Authenticator Protocol, which extended the U2F use case to do a couple of things. One, it allows for passwordless authentication by enabling resident credentials in a security key. But secondly, it also extends the use case to allow devices to be the authenticator. So now your handset could be a security key in addition to a security key. So that starts to broaden the addressable base of users who can leverage FIDO authentication on the client side. Those two things together, WebAuthn and CTAP, comprise FIDO 2. So you see a lot of talk about FIDO 2 because that's where a lot of enterprises are starting to really move towards, because FIDO 2 is supported in the Windows environment and in a lot of kind of enterprise infrastructure. So that's one reason why there's a lot more adoption now, I think, in the enterprise with FIDO 2 than you may have seen with just U2F. But frankly, it's that kind of platform support and the web support that's really ushering in a huge wave of adoption for FIDO authentication. So specifically, FIDO 2 is supported in a couple of important platforms. One is the web. right? So one of the benefits of working in W3C is that as soon as WebAuthn was done as part of the FIDO2 spec, we had support out of the box from leading web browsers, from Microsoft, Mozilla, and Google. And later on, Apple has been supporting WebAuthn in Safari. So that's a platform in of itself. Separately, as we talked about earlier, Windows Hello is a FIDO certified authenticator, basically. So Windows 10 it supports FIDO2 inherently. So any built-in biometric on a Windows 10 machine can be used in lieu of a password for login on sites that support WebAuthn or FIDO authentication. So Windows 10 is a FIDO certified environment. Additionally, Android is a FIDO certified environment. So any Android 7 or later handset can support FIDO authentication, and likewise, use the local biometric instead of a password, both for native apps and for web-based authentication. All right. So a good example of this for those of you who have an Android device, visit eBay.com and go to log in, with your Android device, and it'll prompt you to use your biometric instead of using the password. And then most recently, Apple announced support for FIDO and their update to iOS and macOS that will allow Safari to also explicitly support FIDO authentication with native biometrics on iPhones and MacBooks. So that really starts to extend the addressable user base. So all told, over the past year and a half, as we've seen this platformization of FIDO through FIDO2, there's billions of added devices that can now consume FIDO authentication. So I think that that expansion of the addressable market by default is one reason why we're seeing so many companies now ramp up their plans to support FIDO. So yes, that is, going back to your question, that is FIDO2 on those platforms, but ultimately to us, I see it all as FIDO authentication, because it all has the same exact benefits as the initial set of specifications brought to the table. But it's in general, it's good to see this broad movement to support FIDO.
What are some of the FIDO or FIDO2 enterprise use cases that people should be thinking about if they're sitting in a CISO chair, or maybe as a member of an IAM program or IAM architect? Because I know a lot of the focus is typically paid on the end user experience. What if I'm trying to implement something like this as just a normal corporate environment? What are some of the things that you could offer to those types of folks?
Well, I think let's talk about a couple of things. So one, you need to think about your use case and your infrastructure. All right. So no environments, every environment's a little bit different. We talked about Microsoft support for FIDO, right? So if you're a Microsoft shop, moving towards FIDO is somewhat straightforward, right? So Azure AD, for example, has FIDO support for users, and of course the desktops all support FIDO as well. But also, another thing I think that a lot of CISOs are dealing with and security folks are worried about are, the new, entirely remote workforce. How are these people accessing system resources? We were talking about phishing before. Phishers are targeting remote workers, and so you need to make sure that they're accessing systems as securely and as easily as possible. So, we encourage CISOs to think about deploying security keys out to their remote workforce, and get them moving in that direction as soon as possible, or using other kind of device biometrics, either on device or using a phone as a login to protect their workforce as well. So I think those are key things to think about. Is what's your use case, what's your infrastructure look like, and there certainly are products that can be brought to bear to protect the workers and system resources alike. Something else that FIDO Alliance is doing as a body, I mentioned before, we do three things. One of those being establishing best practices for implementations of FIDO authentication. We have a working group focused only, exclusively on enterprise deployment use cases. So we just actually released a white paper on CXO considerations for moving to a passwordless enterprise. It's actually going to be the first in a series of papers that get into more granular depth on exactly how to implement FIDO inside the enterprise. So, I'd encourage people to check it out. We'll include some links as part of this podcast, but to check out that series to get more details on these best practice recommendations, which are being developed by actual enterprise practitioners inside of FIDO Alliance.
So Andrew, we talked a lot about the security benefits, the usability benefits. There's obvious benefits to the organization. Thinking of it from the standpoint of the money people, how does doing FIDO move the needle? I mean, I can think from a cost perspective, there's the avoidance of data breaches, but can you kind of address that? Where within an organization, who cares? How do I get something like this approved? And how do I show that I can get an ROI and move the needle for the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's interesting because I think opinions on this have shifted a little bit, or at least grown, got broader. So initially, all the focus is on cost avoidance, as you mentioned, like avoiding a data breach. Like the cost of a data breach, first of all, that should be enough. Avoiding data breach from a cost standpoint and a reputation standpoint, should be a large enough imperative to move away from passwords and towards something like FIDO. But there's other costs associated with in the enterprise associated with not using FIDO or having complex authentication, right? So password resets. You see estimates for that ranging from $100 to $1,000 per reset. Once you factor in the cost of downtime and systems and things like that. So password resets are expensive. Lost productivity time. If someone can't get into a system or can't access a system because it's too complex or they forgot a password or whatever it might be, you're losing. That's money being spent on an employee not actually working. Other costs are if you're depending on tokens, right? So the hardware costs associated with deploying so many tokens, the more advanced tokens are very expensive. So I think inside the enterprise, FIDO A prevents data breaches, B gets rid of password resets, and C makes it easier to log in. Google did a case study a couple of years ago, which is we cite often because is tens of thousands of employees over a multi-year study using U2F security keys. What they found, first of all, we generally talk about the fact that this study found that not one of them got phished, right? Which is super important and goes to the core security message and the bottom line benefits associated with that. But the other part of that study points to the fact that call center support desk calls went way down, and productivity went way up. And they also got some sentimental feedback from people that they liked that login experience better. So, what you're talking about there is, those are three costs that are reduced plus happy employees is beneficial to the company as well. So I think there's a lot of ways to look at how FIDO creates cost savings, and those are just some of them. Additionally, there's top line benefits. So for companies that are selling to consumers, around half of shopping cart abandonments are due to password issues. People can't log in, they can't do that impulse buy, they decide not to buy. That's a huge opportunity cost. Additionally, we think that there's brand benefit associated with the better login experience. So we've recently actually introduced a consumer logo that we anticipate service providers using, or a Powered by FIDO button that we anticipate service providers using to express to their consumers that they are providing a industry blessed, safer, superior, simpler login experience. And we think there should be a halo effect associated with that. But even without the FIDO logo, a better login experience is good for one's brand. In fact, so what I was saying before about how I think that opinions have evolved on this is that whereas initially most of the focus was on cost avoidance, we're seeing a lot of companies now focus on the usability aspects of this. This is better for my customers. It's making me have happier customers, stickier customers, and things like that. So a lot more focus now, from decision makers on the top line benefits in addition to the bottom line cost avoidance.
Yeah, I really like that idea. So you have my stamp of approval on the Powered by FIDO logo or badge. It's kind of like the Intel inside. But I wanted to go back to another point that you made or maybe it was you agreeing with my point around the data breaches, because I think when, Jeff and I were talking about data breaches, 5 years ago, it felt more to executives like we were spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I feel like we've come a long way since then. And anybody who thinks that is just, not tuned in. I mean, the cost of a data breach, I think we saw a statistic recently that the cost of a data breach, at least in the US, is like over $8 million. Globally, it's over $3 million. And that's made up of, a lot of it is the companies have to run around and make good for the fact that they fumbled people's data, right? And that they now may be the victims of identity fraud. So it's not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And those numbers I threw out there, those are averages, right? That includes a lot of the smaller breaches. And if you get hit by a really big breach, it can cost you much more in terms of dollars, as well as what I think you pointed out in terms of brand reputation, which is a little hard to quantify. But it's not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And hopefully that message is getting out there.
No, it's quite real, and this comes back to the question you asked earlier. Why FIDO? Why does FIDO exist? And this is what we're trying to solve, right? So we're trying to solve the data breach problem. So we're often associated rightly with reducing reliance on passwords, but we're doing that to solve the data breach problem, because that is they're expensive and problematic, and it really just erodes the integrity of the network economy itself, and that's not good for anybody.
Yeah, I think from a strategy standpoint, if you're in security, the two vectors that I would pay attention to, and there are so many vectors, right? But the first one is the password and being able to get rid of that and secure it in a better way, right? Using technologies like MFA, which combined with FIDO make it easier to use. And then being able to mitigate against ransomware attacks. The news today is Canon got hit by a ransomware attack. So and that's a pretty big one, right? And they're not sure if images were stolen. So that adds another wrinkle to it. So having the appropriate stance towards security, not only making it available, making it easy to use, I think is critically important to the adoption and improving security as a whole. Because what you don't want to have is, you spend a bunch of money on getting something in place, and if it's unusable, no one's going to use it. What's the point?
Yeah.
Right? They're just going to find ways around it. So I think I love what's happened with FIDO, and I hope and pray that other organizations will start to kind of see the light and consider security as a end user experience as much as possible. And by that I mean taking it to the effective usability of it. So I think it's super important.
On those lines, I think that the change in with COVID and everything, this remote workforce, your employees are now your consumers too, right? So even in the enterprise, you need to think about how are these employees going to log into systems, securely, and people will find workarounds for security when they can, but not everyone, but a lot of employees will. They just want to log in. They're just trying to do their job, So you need to think about usable, secure methodologies for granting remote access to systems, and that's where another area where FIDO does excel.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff, right, leads to things like forwarding emails to a personal email address. Well, I can't get to my regular work account, or it's too hard, or whatever it is, right? There's all kinds of excuses, but they're solving a usability issue around that, right? If you make it easy for people to do their work and make it secure, you start to eliminate some of those examples of reasons why people would try to look for ways around the security postures that people have put in place to make their organization more secure.
Yep.
So like I said, I'm in favor of it, which is a great thing. And I know you mentioned that white paper. We definitely will have a link to that in our show notes. I guess from a elevator pitch, right? Why should someone read that white paper, and what do you think that they'll take away out of it in 30 seconds or less?
Well, it's really just getting people started on focusing on the enterprise benefits of moving towards passwordless authentication for users, right? So it's squarely focused on that. It's an enterprise paper that from CISO on down in that organization can look at it. Succinctly summarizes key considerations and the hows and why and how to deploy FIDO. And as I mentioned, it's the beginning of a series that will get into more and more depth. In fact, we'll have a blog post on this shortly that kind of starts to outline the series in and of itself so people can see the key steps associated with deploying FIDO in the enterprise. One thing, and this is a little inwardly focused, I suppose, but one thing we realize, our goal is to get people to move to FIDO, right? We're unique in the sense that we're a nonprofit organization. We're not pitching product. We're just trying to get people to use better authentication. But we have a lot of good high-level information on our website, and we have some, a lot of specs. All the specs are open. We have some very detailed white papers, but we're trying to find this sweet spot to make FIDO actionable for practitioners. So I think this series of papers will really be helpful. They'll all be around 5 pages each, very actionable and lots of information. So I think that's what this paper signals and is a good starting point to do.
So I'd like to beat a dead horse here, because I think everybody probably agrees that the passwords are not a good enough control. But just as a practitioner myself, I think to myself, if I'm relying on passwords, I can be pretty sure those passwords have already been hacked for a large number of users. I had to sign up for a Little League website the other day and create an account with a password. And I thought, there's no way there's good enough technology on the back end of this Little League website to secure my password. I'm not picking on Little League. I'm picking on all the hundreds of websites that we use every couple of years to create accounts. And whether or not, those of us in the IAM industry use a password locker, that's fine. The average Joe on the street doesn't. And that's why you can be pretty sure that if you have a system that relies on email address and password, it's going to get compromised.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've said it before, password is not modern authentication. So if that's all you're offering, you're way behind already. Okay, so I think, I'm looking forward to the next series of the papers, and we'll put a link to the FIDO Alliance website as part of the show notes here. I like that, the one you just put out. It is definitely an easy read, and I think it's a good way for people to start to think about how to position the cell within the organization of why we should start to move towards that direction. So if you're interested in getting started with FIDO or learning more about it, I think you've hit it right on the nail on the head with that paper. So definitely check that out on the FIDO Alliance website and also in the show notes that we'll have here, which I'll have a direct link to it. Andrew, certainly appreciate your time, and I know you're a busy guy. Any last words of wisdom that you want to throw out there for the folks who are listening?
I think we hit on all the key points, and I hope people, they enjoy listening to us today and take something away from this. Look for that paper. One other thing that we're doing, we have an industry conference that we were going to launch this year in person. We're going to do virtually instead, called Authenticate. So this was going to be a 2-day conference focused on all the ins and outs of authentication, not just FIDO, authentication best practices. We had maybe a dozen case studies planned. So kind of a case study track, a technical track, a standards track. All that's being rolled up into a virtual event. So you can find information on that on our website, but also on authenticatecon.com. That is going to be taking place in the middle of November. I strongly encourage people to sign up to attend that if they want to learn more as well. And that's going to be free to attend. Great content was submitted for this paper. Just a little anecdote on Authenticate. We thought we were going to have a hard time pulling together the agenda. We had around 6 times as many papers submitted as we had agenda slots, which to me was super exciting because it helped us put together an awesome set of content, but also it shows that this is really gaining traction in the marketplace. We had submissions from all corners of the world talking about different implementations and applications of FIDO. So all that's being brought forward into this event. I strongly encourage people to make sure to sign up and attend.
That's great. Yeah, I'll definitely put a link to that. It's for the website. It's authenticatecon.com, and I'll have a link to the show notes as well. And I think that's fantastic. It's going to be free. I think we saw a lot of good uptake with Identiverse, for example, which I believe wrapped up last week, or maybe it's wrapping up this week. It's weird because it's stretched out over several weeks, right? But yeah, I'm definitely going to be registering for that and looking forward to it. So great deal. Jim, anything else that you want to close out with before we let Andrew go?
No, I just wanted to say, Andrew, I really appreciate your time. I know as the CEO of FIDO that you are an extremely busy person, and just appreciate you taking the time to educate our listeners.
No, thank you both for having me. I mean, you have many people you could be talking to, and I appreciate it. And our goal is to get the word out and get people engaged. And thank you for this opportunity.
Great. Appreciate it, Andrew. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcasts, and you can check us out on the web at identityatthecenter.com. We're in your favorite podcast app, so feel free to subscribe, follow, like, whatever the thing is that your podcast app does. That helps us immensely and helps us get great guests like Andrew in the future. So with that, we'll go ahead and close it out for this week, and we'll be talking with y'all in the next one. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.